So looking back at the progressive era, we are going to see a rise in education. In this time period, at the end of the Gilded Age, beginning of our period 7 time period, the progressive and imperialism time period, we're going to see that college enrollment increases like 4 times over. So colleges will start focusing on new modern topics, and some of those modern topics include political science, how does the government work, sociology, how do people interact with each other, how should our society be run. So they apply science principles like the methodology and hypothesis and testing things to studying human life. So looking at how people interact with each other, looking at how people interact with the government in order to solve the problems, the ills of society politically, socially, and economically. And the idea of survival of the fittest and social Darwinism and the rich are rich because they have evolved to be so kind of fades away. I don't want to say fades away, but in the progressive's mind is seen as not the correct theory to apply to the social classes, because people react to their environment and changes in their government in their own way, and they change their laws and customs to fit things, and that sometimes there's disadvantages and consequences of someone's actions make someone else poor, not because that person themselves is less than. So that completely combats social Darwinism. So let's look at muckrakers, of which you have read some of their reading. So I'm going to like fly through these next things. So a muckraker, actually, the term muckraker was meant to be derogatory. It was Teddy Roosevelt talking about, I think, David Phillips. I think we'll get to him in a minute. But he was just trying to make it sound like sarcastic and derogatory, like, why are they doing this? Why are they bringing all this stuff to light? But we look at it nowadays, we look back and be like, wow, they did such a good job. They got in the muck, the nastiness of society, and raked it up and exposed it. But at the time period, it was like a nasty word. You didn't want to be called a muckraker. But now we look back and we're like, good job, guys. So they want to expose the evils of society, and the way that they do so is through journalism. So we've already learned about one, Thomas Nast. He was a cartoonist, and he wouldn't consider himself a muckraker, but we do nowadays. So we look back at him and we see him as someone who exposed the issues with Reconstruction, exposed the issues of the Chinese Exclusion Act, exposed the issues especially of Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall, and actually brought down Boss Tweed and the Tweed Ring because of his cartoons. So during this time period, a lot of books actually started out as articles. People would post a series of articles in magazines like McClure's or Collier's magazine, and Cosmopolitan was actually started during this time period as like an investigative journalist magazine. Wow, things have changed. So this is how most of these muckrakers went about raking up their muck. Jacob Riis is the first. We're going to look at pictures of his in class. Jacob Riis was an immigrant from Denmark, if I am correct. And let me find my notes on him, make sure I get it right for you guys. Riis started out working odd jobs here and there, but finally found his niche as a police photographer. And he was actually very good at using flash photography, which is a new thing for the time period. So cameras are now more handheld during this time period. They still need to be developed via darkroom and those sort of photography techniques. But with the advent of electricity, there's the idea to make it, let's take pictures in the dark. And so he saw, being a crime photographer, he saw these slums, the areas of town where all these crimes are actually occurring. And he got the idea to show the rich and the middle class how the other half lives, which is the name of his book. So he takes these pictures in basements, in cellars, in tenements. He takes pictures of orphans on the street, we're going to look at them, and puts them in this book, goes around the Northeast on a book tour showing everyone what he has found, and people are actually stunned. People that live in the suburbs, people that live in the nice parts of town, people that live in rural areas are like, this is America? This isn't what our principles are. The poor being treated this way is not how it's meant to be. There will be pushback that we can attest to his work. And in New York City, they will pass the 1906 Tenement Act, which required a few things of your tenement. You had to have a bathroom for every floor. You had to have an electric light in every hallway. You could only have a certain number of tenants in your apartment. So his book actually led to reform. Lincoln Steffens and the Shame of Cities. It's a book now, but originally it was produced in a series of articles that were like fact checked. And so Lincoln Steffens' Shame of Cities is in 1902, and the idea is to unmask the alliances between big business and local government. How is big business and these trusts paying off government officials to not pass the things that are going to hurt them? Ida Tarbell, one of our only women muckrakers that we'll learn about in class, she lived this life where her father was trying to break into some of these industries but couldn't because many trusts were blocking the way. So she, in her book, like an expose on Standard Oil, kind of exposes John D. Rockefeller's tactics to crush competition, to destroy their reputations or buy out their businesses or make it impossible for them to sell their goods. And so she exposes the way this is done, and the government actually investigates Standard Oil and breaks up the trust, shuts them down in 1911, thanks to Ida Tarbell. Sinclair is my absolute favorite. His expose, The Jungle, it's actually a novel, a fictional novel, but it's all based on true things that he experienced. So Upton Sinclair essentially like dressed up, like went incognito, and acted as if he were an immigrant working in a meatpacking facility in Chicago, took notes on everything that he saw. I think it was like a 3-week stint, or maybe it was 3 months. It was 3-something stint of working in a meatpacking facility, took notes on everything he saw, and then wrote a fictional account of a Lithuanian immigrant coming to America named Jurgis, and the horrors that an immigrant has to go through living in America. His wife dies in childbirth. He works in this nasty meatpacking facility where rats and feces and chemicals and people's germs are all up in the meat that is being made, and old meat, and the waste from old meats will just be poured back in, and there's metal and just nasty stuff's being ground up in the meat, and workers are treated terribly. They're caught up in machines. The labor unions are shut down immediately. And so we're going to read some of this in class. Jurgis's child dies drowning in a mud pit on the side of the road. It's just horrible. And all these things are based off of true things that he had seen or experienced himself in Chicago when he worked in this facility. His work actually leads to the same year or a year after to laws about meat inspection and the Pure Food and Drug Act. So meat needed to be inspected before it's taken across state lines. So that's how many of these meatpacking facilities had gotten around the laws that had already been set in place. Well, if you're not going to let me sell my nasty meat here, I'll ship it somewhere else, sort of idea. And the Pure Food and Drug Act will set up regulations that your food has to meet, and it will eventually lead to the FDA that we have today. David Phillips and the Treason of the State articles were written in Cosmopolitan, and then once they were all done, they were compiled into a book. And his whole idea is that he investigated 90 senators, kind of like undercover, and proved that 75 of them did not actually represent their constituents, I can't talk today, their constituents, but rather they were really being bribed by railroads and companies. And David Phillips will actually get shot, like attempted assassination, because of his article and the things that he exposed. And he's the one that President Roosevelt called a muckraker. Like, why are you trying to rake up all this muck and make the government look bad? Again, we take the term as a good thing, but back then it was kind of like, hush, hush, you didn't want to be known as a muckraker. And actually, some of these magazines will go to great ends to fact check their ideas. So Ida Tarbell's book, her articles that will be turned into a book, the magazine she published them in, like, spent thousands of dollars fact checking it before they put it up, because they didn't want their magazine to have a bad name as like a slanderous yellow journalism, it's not true magazine. And lots of magazines after Teddy Roosevelt and the treason of the state debacle, where he calls them muckrakers and he means it derogatorily, will stop publishing muckraking things because they don't want their magazine to go under to get a bad name. All right, two women I want you guys to know about, two like progressive women, not muckrakers, but people that fight for the rights of those that need their rights fought for. Jane Addams, sometimes known as Saint Jane. So, she is kind of like one of this first generation of college educated women. So after the Civil War, many women actually ended up going to college, middle class or upper class women. Jane Addams will fight for female suffrage, but she will fight for African American rights through the NAACP. But most importantly, she starts this idea of settlement housing, and settlement housing is a movement that centers around what women are able to do during this time period. Unfortunately, there wasn't much politically they could do, but socially they could help in whatever way they can. So settlement houses were houses near or in the slums set up by middle-class women, where middle-class women go and live there and train and work with the poor immigrants living there. So teaching them English, teaching them basic math or American customs, childcare, job training. A lot of it was faith-driven, like the social gospel idea, faith-driven works, but it was important nonetheless. And Hull House is the settlement house in Chicago, but there were many others in larger cities. Florence Kelley. Florence Kelley investigated and reported on many child labor issues. Florence Kelley lived at Hull House and wrote down everything that she remembered from this time period and took great notes about the children she saw that were forced to work because their families couldn't survive. And so they would send their children to work instead of sending their children to school. She was a lifelong supporter of welfare for women, for blacks, for consumers. She fought for consumer protection, so meaning what are we buying, how much is it actually worth, how much are we paying for it, so much so that she fought for like the best way, since we as women during this time period couldn't do much politically, the best way to get the message across was through boycotting. Another women's issue during this time period is the Mueller versus Oregon issue, which we're going to talk about in class. We're going to read something on that, and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire disaster that happened, and we're going to talk about that in class as well, so I'll spare you that in this lecture. So many of the progressive political ideas that we see come from the Populist Party and will be experimented with in Wisconsin, and that's why we're learning about Wisconsin government. Yeah, my husband just looked at me. So today we're going to learn about Robert La Follette. Did I say that right? Robert La Follette. No, La Follette, not Lafayette. Okay, so he's a governor of Wisconsin, and then he will make it to the U.S. Senate. And so as governor of Wisconsin, his idea is to destroy local political machines and kind of clean up the politics of Wisconsin and wrestling away the control of railroads and lumber trusts, because lumber is a major deal in Wisconsin during this time period. He is one of the first of the Republican insurgents who's not one of those Republican old guards who's like spoils system and trusts and laissez-faire economics, let the government stay away from the economy. He is a Republican, much like a mugwump, who thinks very differently, that the government should control the economics to not exploit the poor and to not be infiltrated by bribery of trusts. And he's going to kind of enact a lot of these political reforms in Wisconsin that later on all of America will enact. And where he gets some of his ideas and his gray hair is from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So there's lots of political experiments and a lot of new political science, which is a new modern idea going on at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And a lot of those ideas will be put into in Wisconsin and federally. So here are some of those ideas. The direct primary, that means citizens choose who will run in the final election, meaning that we have an election before the election to like narrow down the candidates like we do. Initiative means that citizens can put forward a bill and it will be voted on in the House or in the General Assembly. Referendum means that on our ballot, we vote for and against laws, and that is allowed in Kentucky. And then recall, meaning it's kind of like we have this person in power, let's elect them out of office, like let's remove them from office, essentially. So I'm going to show you guys a map here. And you can look at this at your well. Now, this is 2010, so some of these things might have changed, but this is initiative, recall, a referendum, whether those things are allowed in these states.